Close your eyes and imagine standing at the edge of a vast desert where the sand glows copper in the dying light. Before you rises the eternal Nile, its waters black and ancient, flowing from a source so distant it might as well be another world. You are witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history, the first true nation-state, the first unified kingdom, the first pharaoh. But as you watch the coronation unfold in the flickering torchlight of a temple older than memory, a question haunts the ceremony like a shadow. Who chose this man to rule? What power placed the double crown upon his head? And why does every inscription, every carving, every sacred text insist that he is not quite human? That he is the living god Horus incarnate, chosen by forces that dwelt not in the temples of men but in the heavens themselves? Tonight, we descend into one of history's most provocative mysteries. What if the first pharaohs of Egypt, those god kings who united the two lands and built a civilization that would endure for 3,000 years, were not chosen by men at all? What if their selection, their coronation, their very right to rule was ordained by beings the ancient Sumerians called the Anunnaki? Powerful entities described in the world's oldest texts as coming from the sky, bringing knowledge, establishing kingship and shaping the destiny of humanity itself. This is not just ancient history. This is a detective story that spans 5,000 years and two of the most sophisticated civilizations ever to emerge in the ancient world. It is a tale where clay tablets and hieroglyphs become clues, where mainstream archaeology and fringe theory collide in spectacular fashion, and where the line between gods and kings, between myth and history, between the earthly and the cosmic becomes impossibly blurred. We will journey from the temples of Sumer to the throne rooms of Egypt. We will examine trade routes and genetic evidence. We will explore why a falcon-headed god named Horus became synonymous with the pharaoh himself. And we will ask the ultimate question that scholars refuse to address directly. If the Anunnaki were real, if they truly walked among ancient Mesopotamians as the texts describe, did they then travel west along those ancient trade routes to Egypt? Did they select the first rulers of the Nile? And are the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the entire magnificent civilization of pharaonic Egypt not the product of human genius alone, but the result of a cosmic partnership we have long forgotten? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The story begins not in Egypt, but in Mesopotamia, in the land between two rivers, where the world's first cities rose from the mud and humanity took its first stumbling steps towards civilization. This is where writing was invented, where the wheel was first turned, where the concept of law was codified, and where, according to the ancient texts themselves, beings called the Anunnaki descended from the heavens to shape the course of human destiny. Understanding who the Anunnaki were is absolutely critical to understanding their potential connection to the first pharaohs of Egypt. So we must begin here, in the cradle of civilization, reading the words carved in cuneiform by Sumerian scribes 4,000 years ago. The Anunnaki appear throughout Mesopotamian mythology as a group of deities, described in the earliest Sumerian texts dating to around 2100 BC. Their name has been translated various ways, but most mainstream scholars agree it means something like princely offspring or those of royal blood, indicating their status as the descendants of An, the supreme sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. In the official academic understanding, the Anunnaki were simply the principal deities of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian pantheons. They were the major gods, the ones who held power, who made decisions in divine councils, and who decreed the fates of both mortals and lesser gods. Among their number were some of the most important figures in Mesopotamian religion. Enlil, the god of air and storms, often considered the executive authority of the pantheon. Enki, also known as Ea, the god of wisdom, fresh water, magic, and creation. Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with fertility and the earth. And later, Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, who would rise to become chief of all the gods. These deities had very specific roles and very human-like personalities. The texts describe them arguing, competing for power, making alliances, and even going to war with one another. They demanded worship, required sacrifices, and expected humanity to serve them. In the creation epic known as the Atrahasis, the Anunnaki face a labour crisis. The junior gods, called the Agigi, have been forced to do all the hard work of creating and maintaining the world. They dig rivers, build irrigation canals, and toil endlessly. After thousands of years, they revolt. They burn their tools and surround the house of Enlil, refusing to work another day. The solution to this divine labour dispute is both ingenious and disturbing. The god Enki proposes they create a new being, a primitive worker to take over the backbreaking labour. Using clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god, the mother goddess fashions the first humans. We are not created as beloved children of the gods. We are created as a workforce. Our purpose, according to these ancient texts, is to serve, to work the fields, to maintain the temples, to provide food and offerings that sustain the divine realm. This is a mainstream Mesopotamian mythology as understood by every credentialed scholar. But in 76, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that would change how millions of people understood these ancient stories. His book was called The 12th Planet, and it proposed something extraordinary. Sitchin argued that these texts should not be read as mythology at all, but as literal historical records, that the Anunnaki were not gods in any spiritual sense, but physical beings, extraterrestrials, advanced visitors from another planet in our own solar system. He claimed they came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago from a massive planet called Nibiru, which orbits the Sun on a vast elliptical path that takes 600 years to complete. These alien visitors came seeking gold, which they needed to repair their planet's failing atmosphere. When their workers revolted, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of primitive hominids already evolving on Earth. We were, in Sitchin's view, a hybrid species, part terrestrial ape, part extraterrestrial god. Created explicitly to be slaves in the gold mines of the Anunnaki, Sitchin spent decades developing this theory, translating Sumerian tablets and cylinder seals, and constructing an elaborate timeline of Anunnaki intervention in human affairs. He identified specific Anunnaki leaders, Enki as the benevolent scientist who championed humanity, Enlil as the stern commander who often wanted us destroyed. He traced the Anunnaki's influence through the Great Flood, through the building of the first cities, and through the establishment of kingship itself as a divine institution gifted to humanity by these cosmic visitors. Most critically for our investigation tonight, Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki did not confine their activities to Mesopotamia. He believed they established bases and conducted operations across the ancient world, including Egypt. Now, before we go further, we must address the elephant in the room. Sitchin's theories are overwhelmingly rejected by mainstream academia, and not just rejected, but thoroughly dismantled by experts in ancient languages. Scholars who can actually read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform have repeatedly pointed out that Sitchin's translations are inaccurate, that he frequently quotes out of context, assigns meanings to words that don't match the ancient dictionaries compiled by the Mesopotamians themselves, and constructs interpretations that simply aren't supported by the texts. Then Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar with credentials in Hebrew and ancient Semitic languages, has dedicated significant effort to documenting Sitchin's errors. He points out that this word Anunnaki does not mean those who from heaven came, as Sitchin claimed, but rather princely seed or royal offspring. He demonstrates that there is no cuneiform text anywhere that mentions a 12th planet or describes the Anunnaki as space travellers. These ideas, Heiser argues, are fabrications. Ronald Fritzer, in his book Invented, Knowledge, writes that Sitchin's methodology is fundamentally flawed. He selectively presents evidence, ignores contradictory data, and manufactures connections that the ancient texts simply do not make. So why mention Sitchin at all? Because despite the academic condemnation, his ideas have achieved something remarkable. They have captured the imagination of millions. His books have been translated into more than 25 languages. His theories form the backbone of the ancient astronaut hypothesis that dominates shows like Ancient Aliens. And most importantly for our investigation tonight, his work forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what the ancient texts actually say. Questions that mainstream academia often dismisses without fully addressing. When the Atrahasis describes humans being created from clay mixed with the essence of a god, when it specifies that the mother goddess gestates the first humans in her womb like surrogate mothers, when it provides technical details about a creation process that sounds more like genetic engineering than divine magic, we have to ask, are we reading pure metaphor, or is there something more here? something the ancient scribes were trying to describe but lacked the vocabulary to explain? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the nuanced middle ground. The Anunnaki were almost certainly the gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, divine beings as understood within their religious framework. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss every strange detail in these texts. Ancient peoples were not stupid. They observed their world carefully and recorded what they saw. If those records contain anomalies, persistent strange details that don't fit neat mythological boxes, then those anomalies deserve investigation. Not blind belief, but honest, rigorous investigation. And one of the most persistent anomalies in ancient history is the sudden explosive emergence of pharaonic Egypt and its insistence that its kings were not merely human, but gods incarnate, chosen by forces beyond the mortal realm. Let us now leave the ziggurat temples of Mesopotamia and journey west, following the ancient trade routes across the deserts and along the Mediterranean coast, to the banks of the Nile, to a moment around 3150 BCE when everything changed. Before this moment, Egypt was divided. Two separate kingdoms. Upper Egypt in the south, with its capital at Hierakonpolis, was more urbanized, more warlike, home to powerful city-states competing for dominance. Lower Egypt in the north, spreading across the fertile Nile Delta, was more agricultural, wealthier in grain and fish, but less politically unified. These two lands had different crowns, different patron deities, different identities. They had been separate for as long as anyone could remember. And then, in one of the most pivotal moments in human history, a man whose name we know as Narmer, also called Menes, united them. Through a combination of military conquest and political marriage, he merged Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. He established the first dynasty. He founded a capital called Memphis at the strategic point where Upper and Lower Egypt met, and he became the first true pharaoh, the first god-king of a unified Egypt. The Narmer Palette, one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Egypt, commemorates this unification. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. The symbolism is unmistakable. He is both. He has united the two lands. But there is something else on this palette that should make us pause. Hovering above Narmer's head is a falcon. The symbol of the god Horus. It's not decorative, it's not metaphorical. The symbolism makes a clear statement. Narmer is Horus. The god has taken human form. The divine has become flesh. From this moment forward, every pharaoh of Egypt would carry the title Horus name as the first and most important element of their royal identity. They were not kings who worshipped Horus, they were Horus. This concept of divine kingship is the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was not a man elected by the people, not a warrior who seized power, not even a noble chosen by priests. He was the living incarnation of the gods. In life he was Horus, the sky god, the falcon who soared above Egypt, protecting and guiding his people. In death he became Osiris, king of the underworld, and his son ascended the throne as the new Horus. This was not symbolic. This was not metaphorical. To the ancient Egyptians, this was literal truth. The pharaoh's blood was divine. His body was a temple. His words were law because they were the words of God. This raises the question that has puzzled Egyptologists for over a century. Where did this concept come from? Why did the first pharaohs establish themselves not as powerful men, not as warriors blessed by the gods, but as gods themselves? Divine kingship was not inevitable. Most ancient kingdoms didn't work this way. Mesopotamian kings, for all their power, remained subordinate to the gods. They were chosen by the gods, favoured by the gods, but they were not the gods. Even when kings like Naram-Sin of Akkad declared themselves divine, it was controversial and didn't last. But in Egypt, divine kingship was foundational, immediate, and it endured for 3,000 years. Mainstream Egyptology explains this as an indigenous development, a natural evolution of Egyptian religious thought combined with political necessity. When Narmer unified the two lands, he needed a claim to legitimacy that transcended regional loyalty. By declaring himself the living Horus, he positioned himself above the squabbles of Upper and Lower Egypt. He was neither. He was both. He was divine. This explanation is logical, well-reasoned, and completely plausible. But it doesn't address the timing. It doesn't explain why this concept appeared so suddenly, so completely formed. and it certainly doesn't address the strange connections between Egypt and Mesopotamia that emerge precisely at this moment in history. Because here's the thing that makes this mystery so compelling. Right around 3150 BCE, at the exact moment when Narmer was unifying Egypt and establishing divine kingship, there was intense cultural exchange between Egypt and Mesopotamia. We know this. It's not speculation. It's established archaeological fact. During the Naqada II and Naqada III periods, which span from about 3600 to 3000 BCE, we see unmistakable Mesopotamian influence flooding into Egypt. Cylinder seals, a Mesopotamian invention, suddenly appear in Egyptian tombs. Distinctive Mesopotamian artistic motifs, like interlocking serpent-necked animals, show up in Egyptian art. Mesopotamian architectural concepts, particularly the idea of raised platform temples, seem to influence early Egyptian monumental architecture. Even the concept of writing itself may have been transmitted from Mesopotamia to Egypt during this period. The Egyptians didn't copy Sumerian cuneiform, they developed their own hieroglyphic system. But the idea, the concept that symbols could represent sounds and preserve speech appears in both civilizations at almost the same moment. Trade networks connected Mesopotamia and Egypt through intermediaries in the Levant. Goods travelled back and forth. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan reached Egypt through Mesopotamian trade routes. Pottery styles from Uruk appear in Egyptian contexts. Wine jars showing Mesopotamian influence have been found at Abydos. This wasn't casual contact, this was sustained intensive cultural exchange. Ideas were flowing, technologies were being shared, and right at the peak of this exchange, divine kingship appears in Egypt. Fully formed, as if someone brought not just goods and technologies, but a complete political theology. The template for how to organize a state with a god-king at its head. This is where the Anunnaki hypothesis becomes genuinely interesting. Not because we have proof that ancient aliens flew to Egypt. We don't. But because the pattern is undeniable. Mesopotamia develops complex civilization first. Urban centers, writing, monumental architecture, the concept of kingship as a divine institution. All of this emerges in Sumer between 4000 and 3000 BCE. And according to the ancient texts themselves, the Sumerians attributed these advancements not to their own invention, but to gifts from the Anunnaki, the gods who came from the sky and taught humanity how to build, how to write, how to organize society. Then Egypt explodes onto the historical scene around 3100 BCE with all these same elements, but refined, perfected, made even more magnificent. And just like the Sumerians, the Egyptians insist that their kings are not merely human, that they are chosen by, descended from, embodiments of divine beings. Is it possible that the same external influence that shaped Mesopotamian civilization also shaped Egyptian civilization? That the Anunnaki, whether we understand them as extraterrestrials, as advanced human cultures now lost to history, or as something else entirely, operated in both regions? That they didn't just advise and teach, but actively selected, and perhaps even bred the first royal bloodlines of both civilizations? Let us examine the evidence piece by piece, anomaly by anomaly. Let us look at what we know for certain, and what remains frustratingly mysterious about those first Egyptian pharaohs and their claims to divine descent. The figure of Narmer, also identified by many scholars as King Menes, emerges from history more like a legend than a man. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing over 2,000 years after Narmer lived, recorded stories about Menes as the first king of Egypt. Egyptian king lists from the New Kingdom, like the Abydos king list carved into the temple of Seti I, place Menes at the very beginning, the first name in a line of pharaohs stretching back before history. But here's where it gets strange. The archaeological record gives us abundant evidence of a king named Narmer, his name appearing on the famous palette, on cylinder seals, on pottery at sites across Egypt and even in Canaan. We have his tomb at Abydos, one of the earliest royal burials. We have inscriptions showing his military campaigns. But for Menes, the legendary first pharaoh of the king lists, we have almost nothing contemporary. No tomb clearly identified as his, no definitive inscriptions from his lifetime. The most widely accepted solution to this mystery, proposed by the renowned Egyptologist Flinders Petrie in the early 20th century, is that Narmer and Menes were the same person. Narmer was his birth name, his Horus name. Menes was a title, an honorific meaning "he who endures," given to commemorate his achievement in unifying Egypt. This makes sense. It resolves the contradiction. But it also reveals something fascinating about how we remember and mythologize the past. By the time Egyptian scribes of the New Kingdom were carving their king lists, Narmer had become Menez. The real man, with his complex life and probably controversial reign, had been transformed into a perfect archetypal figure, the first pharaoh, the unifier, the founder not just of a dynasty but of a cosmic order. He had become more than human in memory, even as he likely claimed to be more than human in life. What do we actually know about this pivotal figure? We know that before Narmer there were proto-kingdoms in both Upper and Lower Egypt. We have evidence of rulers from what's called Dynasty Zero, kings like Ka and Scorpion who controlled parts of Upper Egypt. These were powerful men, but they were not pharaohs. They had not achieved unification. They had not claimed to be gods incarnate. Narmer changed everything. The evidence suggests his conquest of Lower Egypt was relatively swift and probably involved strategic marriage as much as military might. He married Neithotep, a princess from Nakada in Lower Egypt, a union that likely secured the loyalty of that crucial region. His tomb and hers are found together at the ancient cemetery of el-Kab near Abydos, suggesting this was more than a political arrangement. It was a dynasty-founding partnership. But it's the symbolic aspects of Narmer's reign that concern us most. The Narmer Palette doesn't just commemorate military victory. It establishes a complete theological statement about kingship. Narmer is shown as larger than any other figure, the classical artistic convention indicating divine status. He wears both crowns, symbolizing his dominion over all Egypt. He smites an enemy while a servant carries his sandals, indicating that his feet are too holy to touch common ground. And most significantly, the falcon, Horus, hovers above him, sometimes shown literally perched on his head. Some interpretations of the palette suggest the falcon is presenting Narmer with captives, as if Horus himself is Narmer's divine partner in conquest, granting him victory. This isn't just religious propaganda, this is the visual codification of a new reality. The king is Horus. The god has entered the world of men, and from this moment forward, Egypt will be ruled not by humans, but by the divine. Where did Narmer get this idea? How did he have the audacity, the sheer theological boldness to declare himself not just chosen by the gods, but one of them? We can speculate about political necessity, about the need to unite two formerly hostile regions under a transcendent authority. But speculation doesn't explain the completeness of the concept. Divine kingship in Egypt wasn't a work in progress. It didn't evolve over generations. It appeared fully formed with Narmer and remained essentially unchanged for 3 millennia. Compare this to Mesopotamia, where kingship was explicitly described as a gift from the gods. In the famous Sumerian king list, the opening line reads, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not evolved from human government, not developed by ambitious warriors, descended from heaven, given by the gods, by the Anunnaki." The text goes on to list kings with impossibly long reigns. The first king of Eridu, Alulim, ruled for 28 to 800 years. The second, Alalnga, for 36,000 years. 8 kings spanning a combined 241,200 years before the Great Flood. These numbers are absurd if we're talking about human lifespans, but they make perfect sense if we're talking about something else. Some researchers, following Sitchin's interpretation, suggest these weren't years at all, or that they were measured in a different unit of time. Perhaps the Sumerian year called a Shah, which appears in the text as a period of 3,600 Earth years. If that's the case, then these antediluvian kings weren't humans with normal lifespans. They were the Anunnaki themselves, beings whose existence spanned vast periods of time incomprehensible to mortal minds. After the Great Flood, the Sumerian king list records dramatically shorter reigns. The first post-flood king rules for 1,200 years, then 900 years, then gradually down to numbers that approach normal human lifespans. As if after the flood, direct rule by the Anunnaki ended, and their hybrid offspring, part divine and part human, took over, each generation becoming slightly more human, slightly less godlike, until we reach historical kings whose reigns we can actually verify. Does this same pattern appear in Egypt? Remarkably, yes. The Turin Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian king list from the New Kingdom, doesn't begin with Narmer or Menez. It begins with the gods. First, Ra the sun god rules Egypt for thousands of years. Then other deities take turns governing the two lands. After the gods come the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who bridge the gap between the age of gods and the age of men. Only after this long divine prehistory do we finally arrive at Menes, the first human pharaoh. Except he's not really human, is he? Because he's still Horus incarnate. The theological genealogy is clear. The pharaohs of Egypt are the direct descendants, the chosen successors of beings who ruled before history began. In Egypt, this is treated as religious mythology. Beautiful, complex, politically useful mythology, but just mythology. In Mesopotamia, thanks to Sitchin and the ancient astronaut theorists, it's treated as garbled history, an account of real events involving real non-human entities. But what if both civilizations were recording the same truth? What if the gods of Egypt and the Anunnaki of Sumer were the same beings, operating in both regions, establishing parallel systems of divine kingship with human or partially human rulers as their representatives on Earth? The genetic evidence is tantalizing. Recent studies of ancient Egyptian DNA, including DNA extracted from mummies dating to the First Dynasty, have revealed something unexpected. Modern Egyptians show a strong genetic connection to populations from sub-Saharan Africa, which makes perfect sense given Egypt's location. But ancient Egyptians from the time of the first pharaohs show significant genetic markers, linking them to populations from the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia. A 2025 study published after analysing DNA from a man buried near Abydos around 3000 BCE, roughly contemporary with Narmer, found that while the majority of his genome showed African and North African ancestry, approximately 20% showed clear genetic links to populations from Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. This isn't proof of anything extraordinary. Gene flow between regions is normal. Trade brings people, people intermarry, genetics spread. But the timing is striking. Right around the moment when Mesopotamian cultural influence floods into Egypt, right when divine kingship appears fully formed, we also see significant Mesopotamian genetic markers in the Egyptian population, particularly presumably in the elite populations who are buried with elaborate grave goods and who could afford imported Mesopotamian luxury items. Were the first pharaohs or their ancestors from Mesopotamia? Were they part of a migration, perhaps a ruling elite that brought not just goods and ideas, but a complete system of government from the East? Or, following the Anunnaki hypothesis, were they hybrids? Descendants of the same Anunnaki bloodlines that ruled in Sumer, establishing a parallel dynasty in Egypt. The texts themselves hint at something unusual about royal bloodlines. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were described as taking human wives, creating hybrid offspring who served as intermediaries between the gods and humanity. In Egypt, the pharaoh was described as the son of Ra, literally descended from the sun god. Royal marriages in Egypt were famously incestuous, with pharaohs often marrying their sisters or half-sisters to keep the bloodline pure. But pure of what? What were they preserving? What made royal blood different from the blood of common Egyptians? Mainstream Egyptology explains this as a way to concentrate power and wealth within the royal family to prevent dilution of the dynasty. But it's worth noting that in ancient texts describing the Anunnaki, great emphasis is placed on bloodlines, on maintaining the purity of genetic heritage, on ensuring that the divine spark passed from one generation to the next without being diluted by too much mixing with ordinary humans. We find ourselves in uncomfortable territory here. Uncomfortable because we're pattern matching. We're taking disparate pieces of evidence and trying to fit them into a narrative that, if true, would overturn everything we think we know about the origins of civilization. But we're also in fascinating territory because the patterns are real. The cultural exchange between Mesopotamia and Egypt is real. The genetic evidence is real. The insistence in both civilizations that their rulers were chosen by, descended from, or actually were divine beings is absolutely real. So let us continue our investigation. Let us look at what happened after Narmer. Let us examine the dynasty he founded and ask whether there is any evidence that these early pharaohs were different, special, perhaps more than human in ways we don't yet understand. The first dynasty of Egypt, spanning roughly from 3100 to 2900 BC, was a period of explosive development. Within a few generations, Egypt went from a collection of competing settlements to a highly organised state with a sophisticated bureaucracy, monumental architecture, a fully developed writing system, and a complex religious hierarchy all centered on the god-king pharaoh. This kind of rapid development is not impossible, but it is unusual. It suggests either that the Egyptians were preternaturally brilliant, that they were building on foundations laid by others before them whose works have been lost, or that they had help, guidance, or templates from an outside source. After Narmer came Horahar, whose name means fighting hawk. Many scholars believe this is actually Narmer's son, while others argue Horahar might be identical to Menes. The identification of these early kings is genuinely confusing because they used multiple names and later traditions conflated figures who may have been separate. Horahar's tomb at Abydos is significantly larger and more elaborate than Narmer's, suggesting the dynasty was consolidating power and wealth rapidly. He appears to have conducted military campaigns into Nubia to the south and Libya to the west, expanding Egypt's territory and securing trade routes. After Horahar came a succession of pharaohs, Djer, Jet, Den, and others whose names we know primarily from inscriptions on stone and pottery. Each tomb at Abydos is larger than the last, each showing increasing sophistication in construction and increasing wealth in grave goods. By the reign of Den, around 2900 BCE, we see innovations like the first recorded use of a tomb with a stone floor and stairs descending to the burial chamber. We see pharaohs wearing the double crown, the Sekemti, which combined the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt into a single symbol of unified rule. But perhaps the most interesting figure from the first dynasty is a woman named Merneith. She was likely the wife of King Jet and the mother of King Den. When Jet died and Den was too young to rule, Merneith served as regent. Her tomb at Abydos is the same size and style as the tombs of the kings, suggesting she held power equal to a pharaoh. Some Egyptologists argue she should be counted as Egypt's first female pharaoh, ruling in her own right before her son came of age. What's fascinating about Merneith is that her very existence challenges our assumptions about early Egyptian society. This wasn't a primitive patriarchal culture where women were property. This was a sophisticated civilization that understood power could be inherited through maternal lines, that divine blood could flow through women as easily as men. If the pharaohs were truly descendants of divine beings, then the bloodline was what mattered, not the gender of its carrier. The second dynasty, from roughly 2900 to 2700 BCE, saw something unprecedented and deeply strange. A crisis so severe it nearly destroyed the concept of divine kingship and the unity of Egypt itself. The pharaoh Peribsen, ruling around 2740 BCE, did something shocking. He removed the Horus falcon from his sarek, the rectangular palace facade that enclosed the pharaoh's name, and replaced it with the symbol of Set, not Horus, but Set, the god of chaos, storms, violence, and the desert. Set was Horus's eternal enemy, the murderer of Osiris, the embodiment of disorder. For a pharaoh to identify himself with Set rather than Horus was theological revolution. It suggested that Egypt was fracturing, that Upper and Lower Egypt were pulling apart again, or that there was a fundamental dispute about which gods should be supreme. We don't know exactly what happened during Peribsen's reign, but we know it must have been serious. The second dynasty, from roughly 2900 to 2700 BCE, saw something unprecedented and deeply strange. A crisis so severe it nearly destroyed the concept of divine kingship and the unity of Egypt itself. The pharaoh Peribsen, ruling around 2740 BCE, did something shocking. He removed the Horus falcon from his sarek, the rectangular palace facade that enclosed the pharaoh's name, and replaced it with the symbol of Set, not Horus, but Set, the god of chaos, storms, violence, and the desert. Set was Horus's eternal enemy, the murderer of Osiris, the embodiment of disorder. For a pharaoh to identify himself with Set rather than Horus was theological revolution. It suggested that Egypt was fracturing, that Upper and Lower Egypt were pulling apart again, or that there was a fundamental dispute about which gods should be supreme. We don't know exactly what happened during Peribsen's reign, but we know it must have been serious. This second dynasty crisis deserves much deeper examination because it reveals something crucial about the nature of divine kingship in Egypt. It shows us that this system, however divinely ordained it claimed to be, was not inevitable. It could be challenged, it could fail, and the fact that it was ultimately restored tells us something important about the forces, whether human or otherwise, that maintained it. Peribsen's choice to align himself with Set rather than Horus was not a minor theological adjustment. In Egyptian cosmology, Horus and Set represented fundamental opposing forces. Horus was order, legitimate kingship, the rightful heir. Set was chaos, the usurper, the force that disrupted the natural order by murdering Osiris. The myth of Horus and Set was the foundational story of Egyptian kingship. Osiris, the first king of Egypt, was murdered by his brother Set, who tore his body apart and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, gathered the pieces and resurrected Osiris long enough to conceive a son, Horus. That son grew up in hiding in the marshes of the delta, protected from Set's wrath, until he was strong enough to challenge Set for the throne. The battle between Horus and Set was epic, spanning years, involving multiple contests and trials before the Divine Council. In some versions, they fought as hippopotami in the Nile. In others, they engaged in sailing contests or tests of strength. Set blinded Horus in one eye, the famous Eye of Horus that became one of Egypt's most potent symbols, but Horus eventually prevailed. The gods judged him the rightful king, and Osiris's throne was restored to its legitimate heir. This myth wasn't just a story the Egyptians told, it was the charter myth of their entire political system. Every pharaoh was Horus, the rightful king. Every pharaoh claimed descent from Osiris through an unbroken line of succession. Set represented everything the pharaoh was not: the illegitimate usurper, the bringer of chaos, the enemy of Ma'at. So when Peribsen placed the Set animal atop his Serek instead of the Horus falcon, he was making a revolutionary statement. He was saying that the Horus kingship model was wrong, that Set, not Horus, should be the patron of the king, that chaos, not order, was the true power. Or perhaps he was saying something even more radical, that the division between Horus and Set was artificial, that both forces were necessary and legitimate. We can only speculate about what prompted this extraordinary move. Was Peribsen from a rival royal family that worshipped Set? Was there a civil war between Upper and Lower Egypt, with Peribsen representing Set-worshipping southern factions against Horus-worshipping northerners? Was there a religious reformation, a genuine theological dispute about the nature of kingship and divine power? Or, following our Anunnaki hypothesis, was there a dispute about bloodlines? If the first pharaohs really were descended from divine beings, from the Anunnaki or their equivalent, then perhaps Peribsen represented a different bloodline, a different branch of the divine family tree. In Mesopotamian mythology, remember, the Anunnaki were not unified. They had factions. Enlil and Enki were brothers, but often worked at cross purposes. Enlil was stern, demanding, quick to judge humanity harshly. Enki was clever, sympathetic to humans, always finding ways to circumvent his brother's harsher decrees. Could Horus and Set represent Egyptian interpretations of the same factional split? Could the choice of which god to align with represent not just theology, but actual genetic heritage, different branches of hybrid bloodlines competing for supremacy? The crisis was eventually resolved by the last king of the second dynasty, Khafre, whose name means the two powers arise, or the appearance of the two powers. His Serek is unique and telling. It shows both Horus and Set, the falcon and the Set animal together. Khafre didn't choose between them, he incorporated both. His message was clear. The two powers, Horus and Set order and chaos, could coexist. They must coexist. Egypt needed both. This resolution is fascinating because it suggests a sophisticated understanding of cosmic balance. The Egyptians developed a concept called Ma'at, often translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order. But Ma'at was more nuanced than simple order. It was the right balance between opposing forces. Ma'at existed in tension with Isfet, chaos or disorder, and the job of the pharaoh was not to eliminate chaos but to maintain the proper balance. Too much order led to stagnation, too much chaos led to destruction. The wise king maintained equilibrium. Khafre's reconciliation of Horus and Set, his insistence that both powers were necessary, was a profound theological statement, and it worked. After Khafre, the third dynasty began, and with it the Old Kingdom, Egypt's golden age. The pyramids were built. Art and architecture flourished. Divine kingship was firmly re-established, with the Horus name restored to its primary position. But Set was not eliminated. He remained in the pantheon, his force recognized as necessary, if dangerous. This entire episode reveals that the system of divine kingship in Egypt was more complex and more contested than we sometimes imagine. It wasn't simply handed down from on high and accepted without question. There were disputes, crises, moments when the entire structure nearly collapsed, and yet it was restored, repeatedly, for 3,000 years. This kind of institutional stability is extraordinary. It suggests either that the Egyptians genuinely believed, with absolute conviction, that their kings were divine, or that there was something real underlying the claim, some actual difference, some measurable quality that made the royal bloodlines distinct from common Egyptians. If we follow the Anunnaki hypothesis, the Second Dynasty crisis makes perfect sense. It represents a moment when different bloodlines, different descendants of the gods, competed for dominance. Peribsen represented one line, perhaps more closely tied to whatever force or entity stood behind Set. Khasa Khemui represented another, or perhaps he was a genuine hybrid, carrying both bloodlines and thus able to unite the factions. This is speculation, of course. But it's speculation grounded in a real historical crisis that mainstream Egyptology struggles to fully explain. Why would a pharaoh suddenly align himself with Set, the enemy of legitimate kingship? Why would this alignment nearly tear Egypt apart? And why, after this crisis, did the concept of divine kingship emerge stronger than ever? The answers might lie not just in politics or theology, but in genetics, in bloodlines, in the reality that the first pharaohs really were different, really did carry something that set them apart from ordinary humans, and that this difference was worth fighting over, worth killing for, worth restructuring an entire kingdom to preserve. The crisis was resolved by the last king of the Second Dynasty, Khasa Khemui, whose name means the two powers arise. His Serach shows both Horus and Set, suggesting he somehow reconciled the two factions, two theologies, two visions of what Egypt should be. After Khasa Khemui, the Third Dynasty began, and with it the Old Kingdom, when Egypt's power and sophistication reached new heights. But this Second Dynasty crisis is a reminder that divine kingship, however powerful, was not inevitable. It had to be maintained, defended, sometimes reimposed by force. It makes us wonder, what was the dispute really about? Was it purely political, ambitious nobles fighting over who would be king? Was it theological, priests of different gods vying for supremacy? Or was it about bloodlines, about which family truly carried the divine heritage, the right to claim descent from the gods, whether those gods were Horus and Osiris of Egypt or the Anunnaki of Mesopotamia? Before we continue deeper into the astronomical mysteries, we must pause and truly examine the Narmer Palette itself, because this single artefact, this ceremonial object discovered in 1898 by British archaeologists James Quibble and Frederick Green in the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis, contains within its carved surface a complete theological and political statement that changed the world. The palette is approximately 64 centimetres tall, roughly 2 feet, carved from a single piece of grey-green siltstone quarried from Wadi Hammamat. It's shield-shaped, decorated on both sides with intricate low-relief carvings that represent some of the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions ever discovered. And it was clearly created for ceremonial rather than practical purposes, dedicated to the god Horus himself in his primary temple. The imagery on this palette is so rich, so densely packed with symbolism, that Egyptologists have been debating its meaning for over a century. Let us examine it piece by piece, symbol by symbol, and see what it truly tells us about the nature of kingship at the dawn of Egyptian civilization. At the top of both sides of the palette, we see a rectangular device called a Sirak. This is a stylized palace facade representing the royal residence, and within it is inscribed Narmer's name using the earliest form of hieroglyphic writing. A catfish and a chisel. The catfish was pronounced Nar, and the chisel Mer, giving us the name Narmer. But above this Serach, on both sides, we see the falcon. Horus, perched on top of the palace, looking down, protecting, watching, the message is unmistakable. The palace belongs to Horus. The king who dwells within is Horus incarnate. Flanking the Serach on both sides are 2 bovine heads drawn in an unusual frontal view, rather than the profile that would become standard in later Egyptian art. These heads have been identified by some scholars as representing the cow goddess Bat, an early form of Hathor, goddess of love, music and joy. Others argue they represent bulls and symbols of royal power and masculine strength. But here's what's fascinating. Whether they're cows or bulls, whether they represent Hathor or raw power, their placement is significant. They frame the king's name. They watch over it from both sides. And if they are indeed Hathor or Bat, then the implication is profound. The king is under the protection of the goddess. He is, in some sense, her equal. He stands between the divine realm and the human world, framed by divinity itself. Now let's look at the reverse side of the palette, what scholars consider the front. At the centre, dominating the composition, is Narmer himself. He is shown in the classic Egyptian artistic style that would remain unchanged for 3 millennia. His body is shown in a twisted perspective, his legs and hips are in profile, but his torso is turned to face us. One arm is raised high above his head, holding a mace, a ceremonial weapon that symbolized the pharaoh's power to smite enemies. In his other hand, he grips the hair of a kneeling prisoner, a man who is about to be struck down. Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, the headjet, a tall conical crown that would become one of the most recognizable symbols of pharaonic authority. He wears a ceremonial bull's tail attached to his belt, symbolizing his strength and virility, and he is barefoot. Behind him walks a servant carrying his sandals, indicating that Narmer's feet are too holy to touch the ground where common men walk. The prisoner before him is naked except for a belt, emphasizing his subjugation and humiliation. Above the prisoner's head are hieroglyphic symbols, a harpoon and what appears to be a lake or body of water. For years, scholars debated whether these symbols spelled out the prisoner's name or the name of his region. The more likely interpretation, comparing this palette to similar later artifacts like the Label of Den, is that these symbols indicate first victory in a marshy place. The harpoon represents the number 1, and the water symbol represents marshland, perhaps the Nile Delta, perhaps the Mareotis region in Lower Egypt. This wasn't just any victory, this was Narmer's first triumph in his campaign to unite Egypt. But look above the prisoner. There, carved in exquisite detail, is one of the most extraordinary images on the entire palette. A falcon, Horus, perches on top of a cluster of papyrus plants sprouting from marshland, and in the falcon's talons, gripped by a rope, is a human head emerging from the papyrus. The symbolism here is layered and profound. The falcon is Horus, but the falcon is also Narmer. They are one and the same. The falcon has captured an enemy, the head emerging from the marsh, and is presenting this captive to Narmer, or perhaps Horus is Narmer, and the image shows the king in his divine form subduing the papyrus land, Lower Egypt, bringing it under his control. The papyrus plant was the symbol of Lower Egypt, just as the lotus was the symbol of Upper Egypt. By showing Horus triumphant over the papyrus marshes, the palette declares that the god himself has conquered the north and united it with the south. On the other side of the palette, Narmer is shown again, but now he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, the Deshret. This is the earliest known example of a single ruler wearing both crowns. The message is clear and revolutionary. Narmer is not king of Upper Egypt or king of Lower Egypt. He is king of both. He is the unifier. He has achieved what no one before him accomplished. Behind him again walks his sandal bearer, and before him march his standard bearers, men carrying poles topped with symbols of various gods and royal power. They lead a procession toward 10 decapitated corpses. These bodies are shown with their heads placed between their feet and their severed genitals placed on top of the heads. It's a shocking image, deliberately brutal, designed to demonstrate the absolute and terrible power of the king over his enemies. The decapitation wasn't just execution, it was desecration, a statement that these enemies were so thoroughly defeated that even in death they were denied dignity. Above these corpses are more hieroglyphic symbols, including a ship, a falcon, and a doorway. These likely represent the names of conquered towns or regions, a literal list of Narmer's victories carved in stone for eternity. In the centre of this side of the palette, we see one of its most mysterious elements. 2 sepulchres, mythological creatures that are part serpent and part leopard, face each other with their long necks intertwined. The circle created by their entwined necks forms a shallow depression, the cosmetic grinding area that gives the palette its name. This would be where, in practical palettes, eye makeup would be mixed. But this is not a practical palette. This is ceremonial. The depression is symbolic. And the serpopards themselves are deeply mysterious. They don't appear anywhere else in Egyptian art. They seem to be imported from Mesopotamian artistic traditions, where similar long-necked beasts are common motifs. This is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for Mesopotamian influence on early Egyptian art. But what do they symbolize? Many scholars believe the entwined necks represent the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, 2 two separate powers brought together, their necks intertwined, their strength combined into one unified force. At the bottom of the palette, we see Narmer one final time, but now he's not shown as a man. He's depicted as a bull, a massive, powerful animal with great curved horns. This bull is shown trampling a fallen enemy and breaking through the walls of a fortified city with its horns. The bull was one of the most potent symbols of royal power in ancient Egypt, representing the pharaoh's physical strength, his virility, his ability to destroy his enemies through sheer force. By showing Narmer as a bull, the palette makes a clear statement. The king is not just a man who commands armies. He is a force of nature, an unstoppable power that breaks down walls and tramples opposition. When we step back and look at the Narmer Palette as a whole, what emerges is not just a record of military conquest, but a complete theological statement about the nature of kingship. Narmer is shown as a man, but he's also shown as Horus the falcon and as a bull. He wears the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt. He is protected by the goddess Hathor, or the power of the bull. He conquers enemies not just through his own strength, but with the active participation of Horus himself, who captures enemies and presents them to the king. The palette establishes several concepts that would define Egyptian kingship for 3,000 years. First, the king is divine. He is not just chosen by the gods, he is a god. Horus in human form. Second, the king is the unifier and protector of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Without him, Upper and Lower Egypt would fall into chaos. Third, the king's power is absolute and terrifying. Those who oppose him face not just military defeat, but total annihilation, destruction so complete that even their corpses are desecrated. But here's what makes the Narmer Palette truly extraordinary from our investigation's perspective. This complete theology of divine kingship appears fully formed. There's no evolution visible here, no gradual development. The artistic conventions used on the palette, the hierarchical scale showing the king larger than everyone else, the use of registers to organise the scenes, the twisted perspective of the human figure, all of this becomes standard in Egyptian art for the next 3 millennia. But it appears here at the very beginning already perfected. It's as if someone handed the Egyptians a template, a complete instruction manual for how to represent royal power, and they simply followed it for the next 3,000 years. Similarly, the hieroglyphic writing on the palette is primitive, yes, but it's already functional. It already works as a writing system. The symbols can be read, they convey meaning, they spell out names and possibly describe actions. Writing doesn't just appear. It takes time to develop, to standardize, to become useful. Yet here it is, at the dawn of the First Dynasty, already capable of recording the name of the king and describing his achievements. The mainstream explanation is that these developments happened during the late pre-dynastic period, in the centuries leading up to Narmer's reign. That the conventions we see on the palette were worked out through trial and error on earlier, now lost works. This is probably true, but it doesn't explain the perfection, the confidence, the complete systematic nature of what we see here. It doesn't explain why these conventions, once established, never changed. Egyptian art in the time of Ramesses II, over 1,500 years after Narmer, looks essentially identical to the art on the Narmer palette. That kind of stylistic stability is unprecedented in human art history. Most artistic traditions evolve, change, respond to new influences, but Egyptian art remained frozen for 3 millennia, as if the original template was so perfect, so divinely ordained, that any deviation would be sacrilege. This brings us to a genuinely uncomfortable question. If the first pharaohs really were chosen by the Anunnaki, if they really were hybrids or descendants of non-human entities, what would we expect to see in the archaeological record? We would expect exactly what we see. A sudden flowering of sophisticated civilization, fully developed artistic and architectural conventions appearing at the very beginning with no clear evolutionary path. A system of divine kingship that makes extraordinary claims, that insists the king is not human but God incarnate, and maintains this claim with absolute consistency for thousands of years. We would expect to see clear evidence of cultural exchange with Mesopotamia, where similar claims about divine kingship and supernatural origins were already well established. And that's precisely what we have. The Narmer Palette doesn't prove the ancient astronaut hypothesis, but it certainly doesn't disprove it either. It stands as a monument to a transformation so profound, so complete, that even after 5,000 years we struggle to fully comprehend what happened at the dawn of dynastic Egypt. Let us now turn our attention to one of the most provocative pieces of evidence connecting ancient Egypt to outside, possibly non-human influences: the sudden appearance of sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge in the Old Kingdom. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the 4th dynasty around 2560 BCE for the pharaoh Khufu, is one of the most precisely constructed buildings ever created. Its base is almost perfectly level, with variations of less than an inch across its 756-foot length. It was originally aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a degree. The ratio of its height to the perimeter of its base is almost exactly equivalent to the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference, encoding the value of pi. The Egyptians supposedly built this using copper tools and stone hammers, without the wheel for transport, without iron, without modern surveying equipment. They quarried, transported, and precisely placed over 2 million stone blocks, some weighing more than 70 tons, in what may have been as little as 20 years. How did they do this? Mainstream Egyptology has developed plausible explanations involving ramps, levers, copper saws, and an enormous, highly organised workforce of skilled craftsmen. These explanations work. They don't require anything supernatural or extraterrestrial, but they do require something remarkable. They require that the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty possessed sophisticated knowledge of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and engineering that appears in the archaeological record to emerge almost overnight. The mathematics required to design and build the pyramids includes understanding of fractions, ratios, volume calculations, and trigonometry. The astronomy required to align the pyramids with such precision means the Egyptians must have been observing and mapping the stars with great accuracy. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift over thousands of years. They oriented their pyramids and temples using star sightings, particularly of Sirius and the circumpolar stars that never set. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is that it developed gradually over centuries, that the Egyptians learned through trial and error, that earlier, simpler structures taught them the principles they later perfected in the pyramids. This is probably true, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the earliest pyramids, like the Step Pyramid of Giza built just before the Great Pyramid, are so dramatically different in design and construction. It doesn't explain the technological regression we see in later periods, when Egyptian construction techniques actually became less precise, as if they'd lost knowledge their ancestors possessed. And it doesn't explain the persistent Egyptian tradition, recorded in multiple texts, that their knowledge was a gift from the gods, that Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, taught them writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, that their civilization was not built from scratch, but was a restoration, a rebuilding of an order that existed in a previous age when gods walked the earth. This brings us back to Mesopotamia and the Anunnaki, because the Sumerians said exactly the same thing. They credited their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, law, and agriculture to the Anunnaki and to the Apkallu, semi-divine sages who came before the Great Flood. They described their civilization not as something they invented, but as something they were taught. When we compare Sumerian and Egyptian mathematics, we find remarkable parallels. Both used sexagesimal systems based on divisions of 60, which we still use today when we divide hours into minutes or circles into 360 degrees. Both had sophisticated understanding of fractions, and could perform complex volume calculations. Both observed the stars with incredible precision and used their observations to create calendars that tracked both lunar and solar cycles. If both civilizations were developing this knowledge independently, the similarities make sense up to a point. Humans solving the same problems tend to arrive at similar solutions, but the degree of similarity, combined with the documented cultural exchange during the critical period when Egypt was unifying, suggests something more direct. A transmission of knowledge, a teaching, a download. This is where the Anunnaki hypothesis becomes genuinely compelling to many people. Not because we can prove ancient aliens flew to Earth in spaceships, we cannot, but because the pattern of advanced knowledge appearing suddenly, being attributed to divine teachers, and then being maintained with great precision for thousands of years before gradually degrading, fits a specific model. The model of a civilization that received a boost, a foundation, a starting template from an outside source. Whether that source was extraterrestrial Anunnaki, a lost advanced human civilization from before the flood, survivors of some global cataclysm who preserved and transmitted ancient knowledge, or something else entirely remains an open question. What is not an open question is that both the Sumerians and the Egyptians themselves believed their knowledge came from the gods. They said it explicitly, repeatedly, and they organised their entire societies around the principle that divine beings had chosen certain bloodlines to rule over humanity, to serve as intermediaries between the celestial and terrestrial realms. The first pharaohs of Egypt claimed to be Horus incarnate. They claimed divine descent. They claimed their right to rule came not from conquest or election, but from their very nature as beings who bridged the gap between gods and men. If we take them at their word, if we believe that they believe this, then we must ask, what made them think they were different? What gave them the audacity to make such claims? Was it purely political theatre, a useful fiction to consolidate power? Perhaps, but perhaps there was something more. Perhaps they knew something about their ancestry, their bloodline, their very DNA that set them apart. Perhaps they really were the descendants of those who came from the sky, the Anunnaki by another name. Horus as another face of the same divine power that the Sumerians called Enki or Enlil. Let us explore this possibility through one final crucial lens, the lens of comparative mythology, looking at the stories told in both cultures and seeing if they describe not just similar ideas, but potentially the same events, the same beings, seen from different cultural perspectives. In Sumerian mythology, the god Enki is the creator of humanity, the wise serpent, the master of water and wisdom who defied the angry god Enlil to save humanity from the flood. He is the patron of cities, the teacher of arts and sciences, the trickster who outsmarts his rivals through intelligence rather than force. In Egyptian mythology, Thoth plays a remarkably similar role. He is the god of wisdom, writing, magic and science. He is depicted as an ibis-headed man, a bird like Enki's connection to water birds. He taught humans how to write, how to calculate, how to organise their societies. He served as the mediator between gods, the one who used cleverness and knowledge rather than brute force. The parallels are striking. Both Enki and Thoth are associated with wisdom and writing. Both are credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization. Both are somewhat liminal figures, neither fully aligned with the ruling authority nor in rebellion against it, but occupying a middle space where they can act as bridges between the divine and human worlds. Are Enki and Thoth the same entity? Different cultural interpretations of the same being? This is pure speculation, but it's the kind of pattern that makes researchers wonder. Consider another parallel. In Sumerian mythology, there was a great flood that nearly destroyed humanity. The god Enki warned a man named Ziusudra, called Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions of the story, to build a great boat to survive the coming deluge. He instructed Ziusudra to bring his family and the seed of all living things aboard this vessel. The flood came, lasted for days, destroyed all life on earth except what was in the boat. When the waters receded, Ziusudra made sacrifice to the gods, and Enlil, initially angry that anyone had survived, granted Ziusudra and his wife immortality and placed them to dwell at the mouth of the rivers. Egyptian mythology has no exactly parallel flood story, but it has something interesting. The Egyptians described a time called Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods ruled Egypt directly. This was a golden age, a perfect time before decay and death entered the world. Then came a catastrophic event, sometimes described as a rebellion, sometimes as the gods withdrawing from direct rule. After this crisis, the gods appointed human or semi-divine kings to rule in their stead. The pharaohs represented the restoration of divine order after a time of chaos. The Egyptians also had detailed knowledge of a precessional cycle, a 26,000-year period that some researchers have interpreted as marking a great year, a cosmic cycle of creation and destruction. The Sphinx at Giza may have astronomical alignments suggesting it was built much earlier than traditionally dated, perhaps during a previous age. Some alternative researchers argue the Sphinx shows evidence of water erosion, which would require significant rainfall, something Egypt hasn't experienced since before 10,000 BCE, long before Egyptian civilization supposedly began. These alternative theories are highly controversial and rejected by most Egyptologists, but they point to a persistent feeling that something is missing from our understanding of Egypt's origins, that there was a previous age, a time before history, when things were different. Both Sumerian and Egyptian texts describe this antediluvian period, when the gods walked the earth. Both describe a catastrophe that ended that age, and both describe the period after the catastrophe as a time when divine knowledge was preserved and passed down through carefully chosen human representatives, the royal bloodlines, the god kings. If we follow the Anunnaki hypothesis to its logical conclusion, here is what it suggests. Around 450,000 years ago, if we accept Sitchin's timeline, the Anunnaki arrived on Earth from their planet Nibiru. They established bases in Mesopotamia, began mining operations, and eventually created Homo sapiens as a hybrid workforce. Over hundreds of thousands of years, human civilization developed under Anunnaki guidance. Cities were built, knowledge was transmitted. Some humans, perhaps those with the highest percentage of Anunnaki DNA, were elevated to positions of authority as intermediaries between the gods and the masses. Around 13,000 years ago, approximately 11,000 BCE, came a catastrophe. Whether it was the return of Nibiru causing gravitational disruptions, a comet strike, massive climate change, or some combination of these, the result was devastating. The Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted over 1,000 years, massive flooding as glaciers melted, the destruction of whatever advanced civilizations may have existed at the time. The geological record shows clear evidence of this period. The catastrophe was real. After the flood, as the climate stabilized, the Anunnaki or their hybrid descendants emerged from whatever refugees they'd prepared and began the process of rebuilding civilization. In Mesopotamia, they established the Sumerian city-states, teaching the survivors how to farm, build, write, organize society. They established kingship as a divine institution and placed their hybrid descendants, the first royal bloodlines, on thrones. They created religion as a means of maintaining contact with and control over human populations. Around 3100 BCE, this same process was repeated in Egypt, and either the Anunnaki themselves, or their hybrid descendants, or perhaps just humans who'd been thoroughly educated in the Mesopotamian system, travelled to Egypt. They found the indigenous populations living along the Nile, skilled in agriculture but politically fragmented. They introduced or imposed the concept of divine kingship. They selected or bred a royal bloodline, perhaps mixing Mesopotamian genetic heritage with Egyptian, creating the first pharaohs. These pharaohs, carrying genetic and cultural heritage from both the East and the indigenous populations, unified Egypt and established the dynastic system that would last 3,000 years. This hypothesis is comprehensive. It explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in both civilizations. It explains why both Sumerians and Egyptians credited their advances to divine teachers. It explains the cultural and genetic connections between Mesopotamia and Egypt during the critical period of Egyptian unification. It explains divine kingship as a real biological reality, not just a political fiction. The pharaohs really were different. They really did carry the blood of the gods, meaning they carried Anunnaki DNA in higher concentrations than ordinary humans. This is why royal bloodlines were so carefully guarded, why incestuous marriage was practiced, why the pharaohs could claim to be gods incarnate. Because to some measurable degree they were, not human gods in a spiritual sense, but hybrid beings with non-human ancestry. Horus was not a metaphor. Horus was a bloodline, a genetic heritage, perhaps even a consciousness or pattern that could be transmitted from father to son through Dem. Each pharaoh, when he took the throne, became Horus because he inherited the divine template encoded in his very cells. This is, of course, deeply speculative. It requires accepting premises that mainstream science rejects. It requires believing that Sitchin's translations, despite being debunked by experts, contain a core of truth. It requires accepting that ancient texts describing gods teaching humanity should be read literally rather than metaphorically. But here's the thing. Even if we reject the extraterrestrial hypothesis entirely, even if we insist that the Anunnaki were just the gods of Mesopotamian mythology and nothing more, we are still left with genuine mysteries. We are still left with the question of why divine kingship appeared so suddenly and so completely in Egypt. We are still left with the cultural and genetic connections between Mesopotamia and Egypt. We are still left with the fact that both civilizations attributed their knowledge to divine teachers and organized their societies around the idea that certain bloodlines carried the right to rule because of their divine descent. These mysteries don't disappear just because we reject ancient astronauts. They demand explanation. The mainstream explanation, that divine kingship was a political innovation that proved useful for consolidating power and therefore spread through cultural contact is rational and probably largely correct. But it feels incomplete. It doesn't capture the conviction, the absolute certainty with which the ancient Egyptians maintained for 3,000 years that their pharaohs were gods. It doesn't explain why this belief never wavered, never was seriously questioned within Egyptian society, even during periods of political chaos, when weak pharaohs clearly demonstrated that they were very much mortal. Something profound was happening in ancient Egypt, something that went beyond political theatre. The pharaohs believed they were divine, the priests believed it, the people believed it, and that belief shaped one of the most successful, stable, long-lasting civilizations in human history. What if they were right? Not in the way we moderns understand divinity, but in some other way. What if there really was something different about the first pharaohs? A genetic heritage, a consciousness, a connection to something beyond ordinary human experience that made them genuinely other, genuinely more than human. We cannot answer these questions definitively, not yet, perhaps not ever, but we can acknowledge them, we can look at the evidence, both mainstream and fringe, and admit that history is more complex, more mysterious, more wonderful than we often allow. The story of the first pharaohs is not a simple story of ambitious men seizing power. It is a story that involves the deepest questions of human origins, the nature of consciousness, the possibility of outside influences on our development, and the enduring mystery of why we tell ourselves that we are descended from the gods. As we conclude our journey through this ancient mystery, let us return to where we began, standing at the edge of the Nile, watching the coronation of the first pharaoh. We see Narmer, a man or something more than a man, taking the double crown. We see the priests performing rituals older than memory. We see the falcon, Horus, hovering above the king's head. And we have to ask ourselves, what were they really doing? What were they really believing? Were they creating a useful political fiction that would help them govern a fractious kingdom? Or were they recognizing something true about this man, about his bloodline, about his connection to powers that came from elsewhere? The Anunnaki, whether we understand them as extraterrestrials from Nibiru, as advanced humans from a lost civilization, as archaic deities who once walked the earth, or as nothing more than the mythological creations of ancient minds trying to make sense of a mysterious universe, haunt the origins of human civilization. They are there in the Sumerian texts described in concrete, specific terms. They are present in the sudden flowering of Egyptian civilization, in the insistence on divine kingship, in the genetic and cultural connections that tie the Nile to Mesopotamia. We may never know for certain if the first pharaohs were chosen by the Anunnaki. We may never have definitive proof that divine kingship was more than an inspired political innovation, but we can look at the evidence with open minds. We can read the ancient texts, both Sumerian and Egyptian, with respect for what they're actually saying rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. We can follow the trail of cultural exchange, genetic markers, astronomical knowledge, and architectural sophistication that connects these two great civilizations, and we can allow ourselves to wonder, to ask the questions that make academics uncomfortable, to imagine possibilities that mainstream science refuses to consider, because the truth, whatever it is almost certainly stranger than the sanitized version we learned in school. The first pharaohs of Egypt were not just kings, they were something more, god kings, Horus incarnate, descendants of beings who came from the sky. Whether that's metaphor or memory, whether that's religion or history, whether that's mythology or genetics, remains the enduring mystery at the heart of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The falcon still hovers above the throne, watching, waiting, reminding us that there are things about our past we have forgotten, things about our origins that remain hidden, things about the gods, the Anunnaki, the divine bloodlines that once ruled the world that we are only just beginning to remember. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me. These are uncomfortable questions. They challenge what we think we know about history. They suggest possibilities that seem impossible. But history is full of impossibilities that turned out to be true. New discoveries are made every year that force us to revise our understanding of the ancient world. Perhaps someday we'll have definitive answers about the first pharaohs and their connection to the mysterious Anunnaki. Until then, we continue to search, to question, to explore the shadows where history and myth merge into something we cannot yet fully comprehend. The falcon watches, the gods remember, and humanity, descendants of whatever came before, continues to build its monuments, tell its stories, and wonder about the stars from which we might, just might, have descended. If you enjoyed this exploration, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into ancient mysteries. Let me know in the comments what you think. Were the first pharaohs chosen by the Anunnaki? Is divine kingship a political invention or a historical reality? Are we the descendants of something more than earthly evolution? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're interested in more content like this, check out our other videos exploring the mysteries of the ancient world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop looking for the truth hidden in the shadows of history.